Welcome to the Compact Podcast. Today we'll discuss the demise of Nagorno-Karabakh, Matt Gaetz's challenge to Kevin McCarthy's leadership of the U.S. House, and companies not hiring white men. I'm joined by Sohrab Ahmari and Geoff Shullenberger, and I'm Matthew Schmitz. More than 100,000 people have fled the region of Nagorno-Karabakh, an Armenian area in Azerbaijan. They are now in Armenia. Sohrab, you went to Armenia last year, wrote a really wonderful piece for Compact, Armenia's Race for Survival, available at compactmag.com. I know you've been following this news. Where do things stand?
Yeah, well, when I went on that reporting trip, unfortunately, I wasn't able to enter the enclave of Nagorno-Karabakh. I only visited Armenia proper. I wasn't able to get to the enclave, which was inside Azerbaijan's internationally recognized borders. And at the time, they weren't letting in journalists, specifically the Russian peacekeepers who control access to the enclave did not permit journalists, so it was very difficult to get in. And that's unfortunate because Nagorno-Karabakh no longer exists. It no longer exists as a political entity. It no longer exists as a place of Armenian life where 120,000 people, including 30,000 children, lived, where their ancestors had lived for stretching back literally millennia, because after an 8-month-long blockade where the Azerbaijanis cut off the territory's access to Armenia proper by cutting off this road called the Lachin Corridor, denying food to the population, denying medical supplies. After that 8-month period of blockade, they launched an invasion, and in response, within the first 24 hours, more than half that population of 120,000 had already fled to Armenia proper. The rest are on their way out, and the government of Nagorno-Karabakh, which the Armenians call the Republic of Artsakh, dissolved itself. The government issued a statement saying it will no longer exist by the end of the year, by the end of the calendar year. I mean, there's so much to unpack there, but the first thing, I was talking to a friend of Compact's and a friend of Armenia's, or I should say of the South Caucasus in general, who knows a lot about the region. And he said, this is in some ways, first of all, it's like the last of a Soviet moment. It's the last kind of Soviet thing that was taken for granted and then just disappeared, or one of a very few at the very least. What he means by that is that, the decision to place this region, Artsakh, which is also called Nagorno-Karabakh, inside as an autonomous region inside the Soviet Socialist Republic, was really kind of an accident of history. The Soviets, when they rolled into the South Caucasus and took over Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia, they were initially inclined to give Artsakh or Nagorno-Karabakh to the Armenians, given its ethnic makeup. But then Soviet nationality czar Joseph Stalin made the decision of putting it inside Azerbaijan's Soviet Social Republic instead, in part for divide and rule tactics, right? To have ethnically mixed regions are some ways easier to rule, and in part their belief that Azerbaijani herdsmen need to, it was their pattern of grazing that they would go into this territory to cut it off didn't make sense from an Azerbaijani perspective, and in part to appease Turkey next door, and in general to appease the Muslim world, and in the hope that their proletarian masses would rally to the Soviet and communist cause and overthrow their own governments. Nagorno-Karabakh as a kind of Soviet entity, as a Soviet creation, an enclave within another nation, is no more. And it's, given the gravity of that, or given the historical significance of that, it's pretty remarkable how little attention really the issue made. Like, a population of 120,000 felt severely threatened and therefore left, which is technically ethnic cleansing. This political entity that had long existed dissolved itself, and what had been a frozen conflict for nearly 3 decades since the dissolution of the Soviet Union just came to an end. So to me, like, the kind of one of those moments where you live through something that has grave historicity, and yet it's like, you shrug, it's over.
So, Rob, I've seen some back and forth on Twitter about whether or not this constitutes an ethnic cleansing. I think there's a kind of sense that when something is described by certain people as an ethnic cleansing or a genocide or a massacre, it's pretty politically incorrect to challenge such descriptions. Usually you need to defer to such claims. You don't want to be seen as a denier of some kind. But I've seen quite a few people pushing back against the notion that this is an ethnic cleansing. What do you make of that debate?
Yeah, no, I think this is an ethnic cleansing. I mean, in the sense that people don't voluntarily choose to abandon their homes and basically with only the clothes on their backs, get in their cars and drive to a neighboring country. No one does that voluntarily. And so when you add in certain historical elements in this, then the kind of charge of ethnic cleansing becomes undeniable. The main one is the fact that the Azerbaijani government for decades has, ever since independence, has injected its own people with this poisonous propaganda about Armenians being sort of subhuman, being a cancer is a language that they've used, being ethnic interlopers, including, this bizarre claim that the people who are called Armenians are really sort of ethnic interlopers who came much later than in fact we know Armenians have been in the region. They displaced this long gone people known as Roman Albanians, not to be confused with Balkan Albanians. And those were the indigenous population, but whereas the Armenians are really usurpers or ethnic interlopers. So having said all of that and destroyed any Armenian churches they came across, defacing or destroying Armenian cemeteries and crossstones, which attest to the indigeneity of Armenians to Nagorno-Karabakh, and putting forward these bizarre historical revisionist theories. You put that together with, the fact that they rolled in with tanks and the fact that people don't normally just sort of up and leave. And I think the totality of those circumstances amounts to, an old school ethnic cleansing or population transfer, as used to happen all the time, frankly, in armed conflicts around the world. One other fact that I always try to mention this is the fact that, the Armenians weren't always kind of angels in this conflict. So when they took Nagorno-Karabakh, or what they call Artsakh, they didn't just take Artsakh itself, but they took 7 surrounding regions to create a security buffer for themselves, and as a kind of to have a bargaining chip down the road. And in doing that, they certainly, they did their own share of population transfers. Azerbaijanis have a claim to this territory as well, to be clear. I mean, individual Azerbaijanis had lived there for many hundreds of years. And those people were expelled. So Azerbaijan actually had one of the largest populations of internally displaced people in the world, up to 1 million who were expelled. And of course, the Armenians themselves did this in response to earlier pogroms by the Azerbaijanis. I don't know. It's all very sad, but I think those wrongs don't make a right. And I think sometimes you see Azerbaijani apologists bring up that fact that there were population transfers by Armenians earlier. That's really a tu quoque argument. It's like, well, you too. Nationalism is very ugly. If one of the big meanings that I've taken away from studying this conflict and reporting on it over the past year and a half is just that capacious multinational empires are better for situations like this, actually, than this very kind of pinched ethnic nationalism that sees individual pieces of territory as only belonging to one people. And as I report in that piece that you mentioned, Armenia's Race for Survival, in its own way, the Soviet Union, in its own twisted way, in some ways, the Soviet Union was that capacious large empire where it tried to create like a kind of homo sovieticus who believed in internationalism, who believed in revolutionary ideals, and downplayed his Armenianness or Azeriness. It did create this bizarre thing that both Armenians and Azerbaijanis now really prefer to forget, which is that they used to intermarry, and that you had these households where Russian was really the language of the household because you had Armenians and Azerbaijanis. Russian was the language of the bedroom, if you will, and of course the language of official life as well. All of that is lost when pure territorial nationalism asserts itself.
That reminds me a bit of Joseph Roth's wonderful novel, The Radetzky March, which I think has some similar intuitions about the breakup of Austro-Hungary. Things are considerably better in the U.S. Lots of doom and gloom, and things are plenty of reasons for worry. But the latest drama politically It's in the U.S. House. Matt Gaetz, the congressman from Florida, has challenged the speakership of Kevin McCarthy, Speaker of the House, leader of the Republican majority. This is an unusual step in parliamentary terms. Basically, it's kind of no confidence vote. The Republicans have a slim majority, so if just a few of the conservatives or populists vote against McCarthy, he will cease to be speaker. That is unless Democrats rally to his side and keep him in place, which some are considering doing. So this may perhaps all be resolved by the time you're listening to this, dear listeners. But I think it's worth asking kind of what's behind the conflict within the Republican caucus right now. And notably, one of the big issues, maybe the largest, is Ukraine funding. Holdouts in the House insisted that the continuing revolution to keep funding the government and not include Ukraine funding. And Matt Gaetz has accused Kevin McCarthy of making a deal on the side with Joe Biden to separately fund the Ukraine conflict. We've talked a bit about this in the past. We've talked about the fact that opposition to funding for the Ukraine war is coming from the populist right, not from the kind of progressive left. I was a U.S. House page in 2002-2003 when the House voted for the authorization for use of military force. With the exception of Ron Paul, the opposition wasn't coming from the right. It was coming from people like Dennis Kucinich, coming from Barbara Lee, people who I think in a lot of ways would be pointed to as the ideological predecessors of today's progressive left. But something has really changed.
Yeah, I mean, it's weird because on one level, this feels very familiar, this whole scenario going back to John Boehner's speakership and the various attempts by the Freedom Caucus to unseat him. And as I recall, Kevin McCarthy was himself kind of part of the radical fringe that was at that point attempting to unseat Boehner and sort of push out the moderates. You know, on one hand, this feels very familiar, sort of from 10 years ago under the Obama administration, when you similarly had a divided government, a Republican Congress and Democratic president. You know, but on the other hand, there are still sort of budget showdowns and debt ceiling showdowns and potentials for shutdowns. What is notable is the fact that, you know, funding for the Ukraine war is the central or at least one of the central sticking points. And so, yeah, I mean, in that sense, even though on one level this feels very kind of tiresomely familiar, it is interesting to see that it's shaking out this way. You mentioned Barbara Lee, who I was thinking about recently, because in another interesting maneuver that's taken place in Congress, Dianne Feinstein has passed away, and Governor Gavin Newsom has appointed a woman named Laphonza Butler as her replacement, thus sidelining the aforementioned Barbara Lee, who, you know, has been through much of her career a kind of stalwart opponent of all kinds of foreign adventurism, you know, and was, in my view, quite heroic in opposing, you know, various initiatives, sort of military initiatives in the past. Interestingly, now Lee is largely aligned with the Ukraine policy of her party. So yeah, I would say that nevertheless, it's, you know, my theory is that she was sidelined because she has not been a reliable party line voter in the past, and therefore is not all that beloved of the Democratic establishment. And so she's possibly somebody who could, under some circumstances, become more skeptical of Ukraine just based on her prior history, although she hasn't been. And I would assume that's partly because, you know, sort of skepticism of Ukraine has become branded as a kind of MAGA position, which weirdly has kind of turned Democrats off of it, lest they be, you know, mistaken for, you know, a kind of ally of the dreaded MAGA. And I mean, you mentioned Kucinich, who, you know, was something of a pariah within the Democratic Party in his time, but is now involved in the RFK Jr. campaign, which has just gone independent and is no longer trying to contest the Democratic nomination. So I think, you know, between the sort of sidelining of Barbara Lee in the Senate race, even though she is not currently opposing the Ukraine policy, and the fact that someone like Kucinich or RFK Jr. himself, who's been consistent on wanting to push for peace, are basically completely cast out of the Democratic coalition. I suppose the interesting thing is this: it's not clear to me that Matt Gaetz caucus of Republicans who are skeptical of Ukraine funding are really significant enough to or large enough to actually wield power, unless they were to somehow be able to find some allies on the Democratic side. And so, it seems like in some ways they may end up being a kind of a fundamentally marginal phenomenon in a similar way to, and sort of easily marginalized, even if they can sort of create trouble occasionally. It is, even though I was initially kind of rolling my eyes at the how this felt like just a repetition of these really tedious kind of power struggles of the Obama era. It does as Matthew indicated, have this kind of interesting relationship to the shifting sort of foreign policy politics of recent years.
I'm of two minds about this whole kind of intra-Republican, intra-House Republican war. On the one hand, another friend of Comex, who's a very prominent person, told me, like the one thing that commends the Republican Party today, if you're a populist and actually care about, the issues the compact cares about, the one thing that actually makes the Republican Party attractive is that it's the one place where there's foreign policy debate, where you can meaningfully challenge funding for Ukraine, for example, and there's enough of a faction. I agree with Geoff that it's still not that powerful, but it is like some kind of minority faction that is willing to take on the uniparty consensus on Ukraine. On the other hand, I have to say that all these kind of shutdown threats and attempts to unseat McCarthy, whom I really dislike. I mean, he's just like kind of like the emblematic, consensus establishment Republican in some ways. All of the kind of, I have no other way of describing it, but like shenanigans of the Freedom Caucus and kind of Gaetz types just makes the party just look, I think it's electorally bad. It makes the party look crazy and unstable at a time when as many contributors to Compact in different ways have argued, at a time where we're actually moving into an age, seems to me an age of consensus in some ways, an age of deflation of kind of very heated politics. I think that's the climate of the country. Lots of anecdotes or even just straight up data that point to that. And so given that, it just, this kind of factional behavior, intra-GOP fighting, I don't think it's good for the party, and I don't think it's good for the country. It just makes it always look like brinksmanship and just crazy at a time when people are kind of tired of crazy. I mean, so I'm torn about this because it's good that there's actually a debate. It's just sad that it plays out in this way, but maybe it has to play out in this way because someone like McCarthy otherwise doesn't really permit meaningful challenges to Ukraine funding. So maybe it's a product of how the Republican House Caucus works.
Absolutely. I think the advantage and disadvantage at once of the less institutional and of less organized, less disciplined party makes the GOP a lot more fun and interesting than its Democratic counterpart. Yeah, but that just reflects the kind of the lack of institutional power and discipline that it has and is able to wield. Other news, we have new data reported by Bloomberg. The U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission requires companies with 100 or more employees to report their workforce demographics. Bloomberg looked at the numbers for 88 S&P 100 firms, and they found that in 2021, after the Black Lives Matter protests, the most recent year for which data is available, the companies hired 323,000 employees. Of those, 20.5 thousand were white and 302.5 were people of color. So 94% of the headcount increase went to people of color. People of color make up a minority of the U.S. population, while making up an overwhelming majority of the people hired in that year. The biggest shifts happened in less senior job categories, but the trend continued up the ladder. There's quotes in this article. David Larker, professor at Stanford, says, these are astounding percentages. A lot of companies said that they were going to make a big push to become more diverse in response to the death of George Floyd and the ensuing protests. It seems that happened. think one question it raises, and some people have discussed this, are these hiring practices in accord with U.S. law, where discriminating against any racial group is illegal? On paper, it is, but there's also a kind of an implicit or unstated rule, which basically holds it's fine to discriminate in favor of racial minorities, but not against racial minorities. Or in short, it's legal, functionally speaking, or de facto, to discriminate against the perceived minority or those who are perceived to have privilege, and illegal to discriminate against the minority or those who are seen as not having privilege.
So one thing I thought was odd about looking at these numbers is, around the affirmative action higher education debate, a lot of it has been, at least at this stage, that led to the recent Supreme Court decision, kind of pushed on the basis that Asians are being discriminated against. And, basically in order to recruit, highly qualified Asian applicants are being rejected in order to make space for less qualified Black and Latino applicants is the basic picture that was drawn by that case that went to the Supreme Court. It doesn't seem, it seems like almost the opposite is happening in this tranche of data, because, this category of people of color is doing a great deal of work here. And what it seems to actually add up to is that a huge number of Asians are being hired in not necessarily executive, but sort of senior roles. And then, basically just the fact that they're not white is supposed to be evidence enough of sort of progress away from white supremacy or something like that. So it seems as if, you sort of see how this strange racial regime can kind of work in both directions, where, on one hand, you can have Asians being discriminated against, but here it would seem, and it's very odd. I mean, there's all these references to underrepresented groups, but in every conceivable category, Asians are clearly overrepresented in this data sample, except for the lowest status roles, right? They're overrepresented in all of the higher status roles. Asians are only underrepresented in the less senior roles, which basically includes like literally, I don't know, I mean, CVS store managers or something, cashiers. I'm not sure, how low this sample goes in terms of status within the company, but, there you have Asians are underrepresented. Yes, they're underrepresented in the lowest paying and most unprestigious role, but are overrepresented in every other category by at least, a factor of 2 compared to their place in the population. So it's a very odd set of results in that it seems to point to the opposite phenomenon of the college situation, where it seems like there's actually an active recruitment of highly qualified and Asian applicants, which is then sort of passed off as, oh, well, these are people of color who are underrepresented, even though, people of color overall are underrepresented on some level, and therefore each group within them is underrepresented when you consider them all as people of color, and therefore even an overrepresented group within the larger category of people of color can be considered underrepresented when they're categorized in that way. So it's a kind of weird legerdemain where these kind of completely fake and artificial categories that are incoherent and make no sense can be used to produce seemingly opposite results. But nevertheless, the overall narrative of racial progress can be sort of propagandized for on the basis of these results, even if they push in literally the opposite direction, right? One of well-qualified Asian candidates being pushed out, the other of them being recruited and clearly, in some sense, sort of substituted for the more actually underrepresented groups as a sort of easier path to progress, because you can hire highly qualified people of color and thereby claim that you are remedying past injustices to all people of color. So it's a very bizarre set of data, even getting beyond the legality of it. I mean, in some sense, I recently read, and I think Matthew, you did as well, Richard Hanania's book about the origins of woke that kind of, essentially goes back to the Civil Rights Act and the various kind of modifications. And then, he argues that it's not so much the Civil Rights Act itself, but the various administrative and legal applications and interpretations of it that have sort of invented all of these bizarre ways of manipulating data, manipulating institutions and reality in order to, supposedly remedy these injustices. But often this turns out to happen on this very abstract level that, if you look concretely at what it produces, it actually often looks quite unjust to, most of the individuals and groups involved.
Yeah, well, this will one day be a more pressing concern for Compact when we're part of the S+P100. For now, we're able to just comment on it. Yeah, I mean, so the Bloomberg story does report that Black workers increased their share of managers and professionals at 70 of the 88 companies, and they boosted their ranks among executives in nearly as many firms. So the Blacks, the ostensible kind of targets, beneficiaries, really the kind of moral figureheads of this movement, did enjoy gains. But as you say, Geoff, overwhelming majority of these things, especially for that kind of upper middle, are going to Asians. I mean, it's just very obvious when you look at the ranks of CEOs of big American companies. There are a lot of South Asians. There are East Asians. So yeah, we're seeing that it's becoming a kind of familiar aspect of the American racial landscape. I do think, though, that these discussions have, really a kind of inexorable logic, which will be greater contestation of, discrimination claims by whites. There's, been some of that, the Bakke case in California that led to the diversity ruling. For a long time, conservatives have said we need to get rid of these laws prohibiting discrimination. They trample, freedom of association. They're counter to our constitutional traditions. There's serious arguments have been made. There's, I think, a lot of commitment to that view of things on the intellectual right. But just as a matter of kind of sheer political contestation and legal logic, what's going to happen is that whites are going to bring more suits alleging discrimination on the part of these companies. So they're far from kind of unwinding the kind of diversity bureaucracy or the HR regime. They're going to start making claims through it with greater frequency. Far from the kind of regime being unwound, it'll become a realm of more intense contestation, I think. I think just one good initial step for us white people is that we have successfully muted Sohrab. We have silenced the voice of a person of color. Are you? I don't know. On this podcast,
as we've noted repeatedly on this podcast, I am now a person of color,
okay.
According to the Biden administration. So I did
not practice the progressive stack here.
Yeah, I really, I'm exhausted. I'm tired. I wish you guys would listen when I talk.
So tired.
It's so tired.
We're
Venmo.
We're always listening and attentive to those voices. We're also grateful to you, listeners. Thanks, Rob. Thanks, Geoff. If you haven't yet, go to compactmag.com/subscribe.